Chapter 7. Molossus. Black Betty stopped and looked back, panting. Her tongue hung gaily out of her mouth, a pink flag flapping in the wind. The snow kept coming, and she shook her coat, sending a spray of white and wet exploding outward, joining the snow on the ground. She sat patiently and caught her breath. The kernels of a long-ago memory tickled her mind. She was given these gifts from the past often, particularly as a nipping puppy battling her litter mates for a fresh teat swollen with her mother's milk. The mock battles she fought with her brothers and sisters were informed by knowledge she had not discovered on her own. The humans called it instinct, but that just meant they could not conceive how the information might have passed to some dumb animal. Perhaps it was simple jealousy that they too were dumb animals, too dumb to rely on the inherent gifts of past generations to know how to survive, how to seek food, water, and shelter, to know the scent of danger and violence on the wind, without being ceremoniously taught about it by their patriarchs. Forced to take all life-saving information at face value from their so-called elders, opened humanity up to all sorts of abuse, quite unlike the other animals, whose ancestors passed down their gifts without self-serving superstition, self-absorption, or any expectation of recompense. After all, their instincts' prime originators were long dead when the stored knowledge was handed down to future generations. The animal's gift was also a curse. Had they instead owned voice boxes and run in diverse tribes, they might have passed word across species to the North American lions or the Australian giant kangaroos that humans were coming and would end them entirely. Alas, with no shared knowledge that the new arrivals were cowardly assassins, the big animals simply stood and watched casually while the pitiful little invaders approached and speared them. The animals that escaped slaughter taught their heirs, rightly, that humans carried with them death and violence, chaos and bloodshed. And if one did not care to be eaten, beheaded, and secured to a wall, or worn as an ornament, fighting was pointless, and running away was best. Black Betty's ancestors were more cunning than most. When the wolves realized what was afoot, certain extinction, they used their skills to teach humankind that they could be allies and friends, useful in any way necessary, anything, to not end up nailed to a wall, impaled and spun on a fire pit, gutted and skinned, their thick, soft fur wrapping the naked humans in their corpses' warmth, their flayed and stripped flesh cleaned and divested of all hair, fat, and other extraneous matter, soaked in dilute tannic acid and turned into leather for armor, boots, and sundry trinkets. No, the canines, those who could stomach bowing and scraping, begging and submitting, would endure anything, not to suffer the fate of their brothers and sisters of the vanishing animal kingdom. Over time, in the care of tribesmen of the Asian steppes, Black Betty's submissive ancestors were nurtured and bred into Molossus mastiffs. Alexander the Great, during his pillage of ancient Asia, discovered the massive, fierce dogs and brought them home with him. When the Romans came along and gutted Greece and Macedonia, they too became enamored of the big dog's possibilities and brought the mastiff breed home to Rome. On the sand of the Colosseum, Rome celebrated the violence that Romulus and Remus's mother's descendants could be coaxed to. When Black Betty slept, the memories of that time came and consumed her. The dreams taught her history as she barked, growled, and twitched, living out her ancestors' lives, creating her instincts. When her far-distant grand dam first fought in the Colosseum, it was against a slave. When the shaking man turned and ran, she ran after. His action told her he was prey. She took him by the hamstring, pulling him down as her own grandsires had taught her to take elk. She bit him under his chin and crushed his throat as they had taught her to kill caribou. The crowd's roar startled her at first, but then she realized it was adulation, and she knew that adulation meant she was not bound to become a boiled leather breastplate or dinner. There would be treats and rewards to go along with all that applause. The next slave she fought was given a spear. He ran when she charged, and she ended him as she had the first. Then they sent 2 slaves with spears, then 3. She vanquished all of them. The Molossus was a surefire hit. When she went into heat in her next cycle, they pulled her out of the pits and let her breed. She next fought a professional slave, a gladiator. She danced well with him. When he struck her with his trident, she stayed locked to his thigh. He died a week later of sepsis. She recovered from the wound and 2 months later birthed a litter of rough and tumble brindle babies. Effortlessly, she gifted them with her knowledge of how to survive in the fighting pits. After the pups were weaned and taken to learn their duty as fighters and guardians, she was unleashed back into the Colosseum. She fought a pair of gladiators and killed them both. But when they sent her against 3 armed professional killers, she could not stand and fight and win. She forced them to chase her through the sand until they ran out of breath. Then one by one she took them apart. It took nearly 45 minutes, and her own breath was heaving, her mouth a bloody foam, her hide slashed and cut by their weapons. But the 3 enslaved fighters succumbed to their wounds, while hers was stitched and bound up. The crowd was bored to tears. She would not fight again. She was retired to the kennels to breed future fighters until she passed. Her last litter of pups inherited more knowledge than the first. They knew that 3 armed men were too many to stand and face. And now, 2 millennium later, Black Betty, whose dreams had taken her through that fight in the arena a dozen times, was facing 3 killers of her own. The trio of risen dead men, enslaving the bodies they had conquered and taken, came over the rise behind her. Black Betty barked and wagged her tail. She came back to all fours and tucked her chest toward the ground, inviting them to play. Like Isaiah, these men were not interested in playing. Murder was all they had on their minds. The man in the center looked to his compatriots. He spoke to them in Norse. Spread out. His companions eased their way out and forward, forming a flanking crescent as they made their way toward Black Betty. She allowed the skirmish line to expand. Then she ran toward the man at her right and skidded to a stop, spraying him with snow. She turned and bolted as he dove after her, slashing with his bayonet, cutting space she had already vacated. He lost his footing, then quickly stood. The 3 gathered themselves, then chased after her again. Betty charged northward, bounding through the powder, leading them away from Isaiah. The game had lost no savor yet. When the sound of distant howling came from the west and reached her sensitive ears, she paused and sniffed at the wind. She could run from the three behind her all day, but the thing she heard and now smelled in the distance was something else altogether. A worthy enemy was out there. Its howl, a direct challenge. Betty's hackles rose, unbidden. She would not shrink if she met the thing, but she would not face it and her three current pursuers at the same time. That was certain death. She sensed the men coming behind her. She leapt forward, running downhill. The notion of a battle to the death with a worthy competitor sparked more collective unconscious memories of blood, glory, and sharp teeth on the fine white sand of Roman fighting pits. If the howling thing was hunting her, it might find her, but she would not back down from facing whatever it was, one-on-one. When she gained 100 yards on her pursuers, she caught another scent. Death and decay, mouldering wool, scabby blood. She found the path, cut in the snow. 5 minutes later, it was trampled to ice by the passage of thousands of boots. She smelled horses, too. A third of the things were headed directly south, toward Isaiah. Black Betty could not help the stab of fear that brought a snarl to her mouth. Her game with the three men pursuing her staled. Isaiah's safety meant more to her than any game could. She stepped into the pathway the legion of dead men had carved and ran with it, as Brian Hugh had before her, hiding her footprints in the path that they had torn through the snow. She knew that no man could track her steps in that mass of prints. After 1,000 yards, she cut abruptly south, seeking Isaiah's scent as she ran. Lieutenant Brian Hugh felt certain he was being watched. They kept looking back, searching the snowy woods, but it was impossible to make out anything beyond the first ranks of trees. Whatever was hunting him was not ready to present itself. He knew one of two things was the truth. The first possibility, that his imagination had overpowered his actual senses. His mind was creating false information that seemed solid and factual. There was no one in the trees hunting him. He was paranoid and losing his mind. The second possibility was that something clever was indeed out there, moving just beyond his line of sight, waiting to make a perfect strike. He was tired and beyond raw, worn to nub ends by the war, then shattered full stop by Good Friday. But he did not believe that his imagination was pulling his strings. He was almost certainly being hunted. Yet the lack of proof made it feel like slowly advancing insanity. He wanted to scream a challenge, throw down the gauntlet and demand single combat, but he quashed the impulse. It would be actual madness to give away his position by hollering into the night. But the game this thing was playing was wearing on him. He felt it in his bones. Something was out there watching him, and it was enjoying the torment of making Brian Hugh question his own sanity. That alone made him want to charge out and saber it to its knees. He felt sure that if whatever was out there had numerical superiority and certainty of victory, they would already have made their move. But being baited into fighting on his enemy's terms was a guarantor of defeat. If he had not lost his mind, if there was a predator out there, he would let it show itself, then he would ride it down. Until then, he fought an internal battle to stay sharp, focused, and most importantly, alive. He kicked his mount to a canter and continued on. St. Quentin was close.